matter how many times I tell myself that sleep paralysis isn't dangerous, the figure that has been following me for weeks enters my mind and threatens to tumult the paper-thin sanity I have left into oblivion. Even now I'm afraid to turn my head, for I know that I'll be able to see that misshapen silhouette hovering hungrily over my shoulder in the darkness. All of my attempts to banish it from my mind have failed. I've talked to numerous psychiatrists, guzzled sleeping pills, injected street drugs, slit my wrists and thighs, and even screamed at it to flee my house until my throat nearly bled. None of these things have worked, though. If anything, they've only strengthened the figure's presence in my life. I can hear its guttural screams reverberating throughout my house even now. The feeling of its eyes boring into my skin through the darkness is making my limbs tremble. I know that it yearns for my fear like a skeleton does flesh, and I can feel it haunting my every step as I race around my apartment like a palpitating heart only moments away from exploding. If I do not banish it from my life soon, then I fear that I will soon be dead, and this letter will be the final memento of my miserable life on this earth. I first saw the figure about 3 weeks ago, as I tried to fall asleep the night before my first professional job interview. I had just walked across the graduation stage to collect my diploma the week prior, and was itching to put this piece of paper to good use. Luckily, one of the local high schools responded to my job query with fervor, and offered me an interview before the ink of my final term papers had barely been given time to dry. As I laid in bed that night, I anticipated as many questions as my active imagination could conjure. I rehearsed the answers to these questions in my mind and was so pleased by my wit that I was all but certain I would land the job. So excited I was about my prospects that I practiced this exercise for hours, until suddenly my nose began to itch. I tried to raise my hand to relieve this itch, but my arm continued laying lifelessly by my side. No matter how many times I tried to stir my fingers, they remained unresponsive under the covers. It was then that I knew that I had fallen into sleep paralysis, a phenomenon which I had read about countless times on the internet. At first, this sensation excited me. I felt like I was having an out-of-body experience and flew unrestrained through the clouds of my consciousness for what felt like hours. But then I noticed a dark figure hovering over the foot of my bed, which sent all of the pleasure that I had been deriving from the experience flooding through my pores like a gallon of putrid sweat. I lay there staring at this threatening silhouette for a time immemorable. Its limbs were too long for its body, and the head resting crookedly on its shoulders was 3 sizes too big. Never before had I seen such a misshapen creature. I would have fled screaming from my room had my limbs not been in the middle of mutiny. Instead, I continued laying there motionless, eyes locked with the shadow-filled pits that served as its eyes, until I thought that I might go mad. Just as I thought the situation couldn't get any more terrifying, the figure placed its talon-like hands onto my bed and began to slowly crawl towards my body through the darkness. I watched in horror as it first passed over my feet and then began to slither across my groin. My skin crawled as its body vibrated the mattress, which shattered any doubts that I still had about the same veracity of my experience. My heart fluttered as it paused over my face. Blackness consumed my vision. My stomach lurched as its lips greeted my mouth, as if it was performing some twisted version of the Dementor's kiss. Just as I feared that I might die of fright, I closed my eyes. The feeling of such a twisted body laying on top of me was too much to handle. I feared that I might pass out. When I opened my eyes a few moments later, though, the figure was gone, and I had regained full control of my limbs. I immediately ran into the restroom and emptied my stomach into the sink. I then looked into the mirror and almost resumed vomiting after I noticed the thick circle of ash surrounding my mouth from where the figure's lips had grasped my own. I could also feel blood running down my shoulders, and when I pulled off my shirt, I nearly screamed when I saw multiple puncture wounds encircling my flesh from where the creature's talons had gripped me. Never before had I felt so violated in all of my 22 years. The feeling of that vile silhouette hovering its mouth over mine consumed my every thought and threatened to rob me of my consciousness. Luckily, I was able to prevent myself from spiraling down into the floor by managing to slow my breathing just enough to calm my racing heart. I did not dare return to my bed though, for I feared that the figure would reappear again the moment my head hit the pillow. Instead, I spent the rest of that night scouring through the internet for experiences similar to my own. There had to be at least somebody out there who had also encountered this figure. I doubted that I was the only soul unfortunate enough to be visited by such a malicious entity. I knew that sleep paralysis was a common phenomenon, experienced by thousands every night, and desperately hoped that my encounter with a strange figure had been anything but abnormal. Although I found dozens of stories written by people who had also seen strange figures hovering beside their beds during sleep paralysis, I found nothing that came even close to matching the intensity of my experience. It was then that the fear that has been haunting my every breath for weeks first began, and which I'm sure will follow me until I am buried 6 feet under the ground. I navigated through my interview the next morning on autopilot, and then spent the rest of the next day contemplating the figure that had terrorized me the night before. Despite my best efforts to remain calm, I couldn't get the thought that would visit my room again that evening out of my mind. I could still feel its icy lips pressed against mine, even hours after that horrifying event, and didn't know whether this sensation and the sudden appearance of the figure had been a trick played on me by my own mind, or was as very real as the bones beneath my skin. The figure visited me again that night, just as I had feared. My racing thoughts once again had plummeted me into sleep paralysis. Within moments of losing control of my limbs, I could see the monstrous silhouette hovering at the foot of my bed. I gazed at it in agony as it once more began to crawl towards my head. My saliva turned to ash the moment its thick lips greeted my own. I closed my eyes in an attempt to banish it, just like I had done the night before. But this time, when I parted my eyelids, the figure remained. It dined on my flesh for hours before I regained control of my limbs, and by then, the sun had long risen in the sky. The memory of its sucking lips passing over my flesh numbs my body even now, and threatens to shatter the little sanity I have left. It is only through sheer willpower that I am able to type this and share with you what has easily been the darkest chapter of my life. It was while eating dinner the next day that I first noticed the figure following me, despite my wakeful state. As I sat there in my kitchen nook eating a slice of pizza with trembling hands, I could feel a set of unseen eyes stroking away at my flesh from the shadows. I careened my head around the apartment to look for the source of these eyes, and then nearly fell out of my chair when I saw the figure staring at me from my shadow-filled bathroom. Its head was peeking at me from around the half-open door, and I thought I could make out what looked like an insidious grin dominating the lower half of its blackened face. Needless to say, I fled from my apartment shoeless and scared half to death. I walked around the city for the next 4 hours, trying to convince myself that an illusion was all that I was seeing. But when I saw the figure staring at me from the cover of a darkened alleyway, and remembered the violent wounds its talons had so recently inflicted on my shoulders, any hope of fleeing from its malicious presence went dive-bombing from my mind. It was as our eyes locked from across the street that the figure let out its first shriek, which followed my footsteps like shockwaves emanating from a sonic boom as I sprinted back to my apartment. This figure has followed my every step since. Its realism increases with each passing hour, and I constantly wonder what would happen if I reached out and touched it. Would my fingers greet flesh as real as my own? Or would they part through its skin like water flowing around a boulder? Both of these possibilities scare me equally. My fear of learning the true nature of this entity prevents me from acting on this impulse. All I know is that the guttural screams that greet my ears hourly, like the chiming of a clock, are increasing in volume with each passing day, to the point now my eardrums feel like they're about to burst. I cannot lay my head down to find respite from these shrieks though, for I know that the shadowy lips of my oppressor will lock into my own the moment the first yawn passes my tongue. So bold is this figure becoming that it even dares to strike me while I'm awake. which has left the skin of my back in tatters. If I do not rest soon, then I fear that my heart will cease to pump blood through my rapidly deteriorating body. The only thing keeping me from curling into a ball and taking my final breath is the thought of the figure following me into the afterlife and tormenting me for an eternity. Given that I am not mentally ill, nor does mental illness run in my family, I have to ask, how can this figure be explained? I leave you to be the judge, for the guttural screams encircling my head as I write this are making me grow weary and are causing my hands to tremble. Thanks for watching. If you like this kind of content, please subscribe to my channel and press the like button on this video. The support would be really appreciated. Thank you once again, and good night.